He has the most recognized voice on earth. And every morning when he wakes up, he hears it and wishes, just for a moment, that he could make it stop. Nobody knew that until Tuesday night. And when he said it out loud, in a studio full of people who had grown up inside that voice, the room went somewhere nobody expected. It was a Tuesday night at the Late Show. One of those clear February evenings in New York when the cold is sharp and clean, and the city moves through it with its particular winter efficiency. Heads down, collars up, everyone moving toward something warm. Inside the Ed Sullivan Theater, the lights were doing their job, the band was loose and confident, and the audience was the specific kind of ready that comes from knowing who is walking through that curtain. When Morgan Freeman walked out, the room responded the way rooms respond to Morgan Freeman, not with the explosive, immediate eruption of a pop star's entrance, but with something deeper and more considered. A rising sound, warm and sustained, the sound of 300 people greeting someone they feel they have known their entire lives, because they have. In the particular way that voices inhabit you, not your memory but something below memory, the place where certain sounds live permanently, where they become part of the furniture of who you are. Morgan walked to the guest chair at his own pace, unhurried, precise. He wore a dark charcoal suit, open-collar white shirt, no tie, a small silver pin on his lapel. His hair and beard were silver white. His face that had aged the way certain landscapes age, not deteriorating but deepening. Each decade adding something rather than removing it, carried its familiar expression, warm, slightly amused, completely present. He sat, crossed one leg over the other, rested his hands in his lap. And the room settled into the specific contentment of people who have arrived somewhere they wanted to be. Nobody knew that within 20 minutes, the contentment would be replaced by something quieter and more complicated and infinitely more real. The first 10 minutes were everything the audience had come for. Morgan was funny, not joke funny, the other kind, the kind that comes from 60 years of observing human behavior and finding the exact word for what you've seen. He talked about his new project with the contained enthusiasm of someone who loves the work and doesn't need you to love it with him. He told one story about a director that made the audience laugh, the particular laugh of people who have just been told something they recognize as absolutely true about another kind of person. Stephen was in his element, quick and warm, following Morgan's lead, asking the questions that opened things rather than closed them. The conversation had the ease of two people who communicate well and happen to be talking about things that matter. And then Stephen set his cards down. The face on cards, the move that regular Late Show viewers had learned to read. The map is gone, we are going somewhere unscripted. Morgan, he said, and his voice had shifted, the entertainment register replaced by something more direct. I want to ask you about the voice. Morgan looked at him. That specific Morgan Freeman look, patient, slightly watchful, the look of a man who has been asked about the voice 10,000 times and is deciding whether this is the 10,001st version of the same question or something else. What about it, he said, not a question, an invitation to be specific. It's everywhere, Stephen said. Documentaries, films, commercials, trailers. It's been in people's lives for decades. It's in their heads. It's become part of the furniture of American life. And I want to ask you something about that nobody has asked you before. Try, Morgan said. Do you ever want to escape it? The room was immediately quiet. Morgan looked at Stephen for a moment. Then he looked at something slightly past him, not the audience, not the cameras, something in the middle distance that only he could see. Every morning, he said, first thing. Here is where the story splits, and both halves are essential, and the distance between them is enormous. The first half, Morgan Freeman's voice was, by any objective measure, one of the most valuable instruments in the history of American entertainment. Not the most trained opera had those. Not the most technically perfect. There were voices with cleaner upper registers, more precise diction. but for the specific thing that Morgan's voice did, the thing that made directors reach for him and audiences trust him and strangers feel, the moment he began speaking, that whatever was being said was probably true and worth hearing. There was no equivalent. The instrument had qualities that resisted precise description but that everyone recognized immediately. A warmth that was not sentimental, a gravity that was not heavy, a pace that had patience built into every pause. It suggested, without stating, that the person behind it had seen a great deal and had made his peace with most of it and was willing, if you had a moment, to tell you something worth knowing. It was not manufactured. It was not technique, entirely, though technique had refined it. It was simply what 60 years of living and working and paying attention sounded like, filtered through a particular instrument that happened to be built for exactly this purpose. The world had understood this. The world had reached for it constantly, for 60 years, from every direction, for every purpose. To narrate the migration of penguins and the expansion of the universe. To voice God and presidents and wizards and detectives, and the particular kind of older black man that Hollywood kept needing, and that Morgan kept providing with a specificity and dignity that the roles often didn't deserve, but that he gave them anyway. The voice had made him one of the most recognized human beings on the planet. The second half, the voice never stopped. This was the part nobody asked about. The part that existed between the projects and after the cameras, and in the quiet of early mornings when Morgan Freeman was simply a man waking up in a room. The voice was his. It was inside him. He could not turn it off, could not put it away, could not walk away from it the way you walk away from a costume or a character. When he narrated his own life to himself, as all people do, in the running interior commentary that constitutes the private experience of being alive, it was in that voice. When he was alone and something happened and he said to himself, internally, well, here's what's happening now, it was in that voice. The most recognizable voice in the world was also the only voice he had. There was no private one. There was no off-duty version. There was just the voice, always on, inescapable, the instrument he'd been given that had also, in some ways, become his cage. He had never said this to anyone. It had not felt like something sayable. Until Stephen asked the right question. Every morning, Morgan said, first thing, I wake up and I hear it in my head, narrating whatever I'm thinking, and for just a moment I wonder what it would be like to have a different one. A quiet one. An ordinary one. Stephen said nothing, let it exist. The problem, Morgan continued, his voice doing the thing it always did, making even this, even the confession of exhaustion with itself, sound like something worth hearing, is that there is no other one. This is the only voice I have. On screen, off screen, inside my own head. It's always on. Does that feel like a burden? Stephen asked carefully. Morgan considered this with the genuine deliberation of someone who does not give careless answers. It feels like a room, he said. A very large, well-furnished room that you have lived in for so long that you have stopped seeing it. And occasionally you walk past a window and you see outside and you think, I wonder what it would be like to live out there. And then you go back to the room. Because the room is comfortable, Stephen said. Because the room, Morgan said, is the only place you exist. You can want the outside, but you are the room. The studio was completely silent. 300 people who had grown up inside that voice, who had heard it describe the universe and the ocean and the human heart and the migration of birds and the nature of God, were sitting inside the confession that the voice was also a kind of prison, that the thing they had received as a gift was also the thing its owner could never put down. Stephen leaned forward, both forearms on the desk. Can I push on something? Push, Morgan said. You said you hear it narrating your own life, your own thoughts, in that voice, and I want to ask, is it always your narrator, or are there moments when it's something else? Morgan looked at him with those eyes, the ones that had looked at cameras for 60 years, and had never quite decided to give the cameras everything. What kind of something else? A character, Stephen said. Not Morgan Freeman, one of the men you've played. Does it ever slip? A pause, long enough to be real. Long enough that the audience understood this was not a performance of consideration, but the actual thing. Sometimes, Morgan said finally, when things are very difficult, when something is happening that is large, I hear the narrator voice shift, and it becomes something older, something that has seen worse than this. Which character? Morgan smiled, the full one, warm, slightly private, the smile of a man who is not going to tell you everything but is willing to tell you this. Ellis, he said, the old con in Shawshank. He has a way of looking at impossible situations and finding the one true thing inside them. When life gets large, I hear Ellis. What does Ellis say? Stephen asked. Morgan was quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice that was his and also somehow more worn, more patient, more acquainted with the long duration of things, get busy living, or get busy dying. Pick one and stop complaining about the choice. The room exhaled. Not with laughter, with the specific sound of recognition, of a line finding the people who needed it, landing in them the way certain things land when the timing is exactly right. Stephen waited for it to settle. Then, which do you pick? Morgan looked at him steadily. Every morning, he said, I pick the first one, even when the voice exhausts me, even when I want the quiet. I get up and I go to work and I use the thing I was given because the alternative is to let it sit silent, and a voice that sits silent is just, he paused. Wasted, Stephen offered. Gone, Morgan said. Gone is the word. A voice that stops being used doesn't wait for you, it just goes. The conversation turned, after that, toward something lighter, Morgan's deliberate choice, Stephen's instinct to follow it, both men understanding that the room needed to breathe before the show ended. They talked about a film Morgan had seen recently that he admired. They talked about New York in February. Morgan said something about pigeons that made the audience laugh in a way that was completely unexpected and completely perfect. But the room did not forget what had been said before the laughter. It stayed in the air the way certain true things stay, not demanding attention, just present, the way a song stays in your head after the music stops. At the end of the segment, as Stephen was moving toward the wrap, Morgan said, unprompted, quietly, almost as an afterthought, you know what the strangest part is? Stephen looked at him. What? I've narrated films about solitude, about silence, about the interior life of human beings who are alone with their own minds. I've read those words into a microphone in an empty recording booth. He paused, and I understood them completely. I just never connected them to myself. Until tonight, Stephen said. Until you asked, Morgan said. That's what a good question does. It tells you something about yourself that you already knew. Stephen said, I'll put that on my tombstone. Morgan laughed, the full, genuine laugh, the one that sounded like the voice had briefly forgotten to be the voice and had just become a man laughing. Don't, he said. It'll sound better coming from me. The episode aired the following Wednesday. The clip, from every morning, first thing to a voice that stops being used just goes, ran just under 4 minutes and was shared more than any clip the show had produced that season. Not because it was a revelation, not because Morgan Freeman had confessed something shameful or surprising in the conventional sense, but because he had said something that millions of people recognized from their own lives, in their own smaller and more private versions, that the thing you are most known for is also the thing you cannot escape, that your greatest gift is also your most constant companion, whether you want it or not, that some rooms, no matter how beautiful, you did not choose. Morgan returned to Lowe's Angels the following morning. A reporter asked him about the interview at the airport. He said, Stephen Colbert asks good questions, which is rarer than it sounds. He said nothing else, got in the car, the city moved past the windows. Somewhere inside him, the voice narrated it. Still here, it said, still going, pick one and stop complaining. He picked the first one. He always did. He gave the world a voice that became part of the furniture of their lives, in documentaries and films and the narration of the universe itself. What nobody knew was that the voice never stopped. Not for him. Not in the morning, not in the quiet, not in the space between one project and the next. The most recognized voice on earth was also the only one he had. And on a Tuesday night in February, he said it out loud for the first time. The room went quiet, and the voice, as always, continued.